Good morning, good evening, everyone, and welcome to what I'm confident is going to be a tremendously exciting and entertaining conversation about artificial intelligence with one of the foremost authorities in the world. Um, Artificial intelligence as a technological advance has captured the public imagination, not to mention investor interest, in a way that few recent technological advances have. Will it turn out to be a transformative general purpose technology, comparable in reach to earlier innovations like electricity, public sanitation, and the internet? Or will it be something more mundane, just a tool for lazy college students to cheat on the occasional essay? Will we still be asking many years from now, as Robert Solow once did about computers, why we can see its impact everywhere except in the productivity statistics? So we're very honored to have with us today Nobel laureate Daron Acemoglu, professor of economics at MIT, and undoubtedly one of the most influential public intellectuals in the world. Daron has recently been thinking and writing a lot about the societal impacts of artificial intelligence. In particular, I was very excited to read some work he's been doing with Simon Johnson, which goes back to an earlier era, the 19th century, the early 19th century in Britain, when cotton weavers were faced with disruptive new automated ways of doing things, and some of the lessons that might hold for the current era. Among other things, their research suggests that David Ricardo, the father of comparative advantage, actually changed his mind about the impact of a disruptive new technology in light of contemporary developments. Ricardo was a member of the English Parliament at the time. So welcome, Daron. We very much look forward to hearing your thoughts on exactly how disruptive or transformative this technology will really be. Will it augment labor? Will it substitute for labor? Is that even the right framing of the question? And of course, what is the appropriate role for public policy? We are also very privileged to have with us Dr. Anantha Nageswaran, Chief Economic Advisor to the Government of India. So the deployment of AI in India is, I think, going to be followed with enormous interest, not just domestically, but it's going to be very interesting for the whole world to see how things pan out. India is already a technological leader in many spheres, for example, the digital public stack. But at the same time, a lot of our workforce is low skilled and employed in the informal sector. So what is the vision for AI deployment in India? What kind of complementary infrastructure needs to be built? How do we ensure that AI platforms are going to remain open and contestable? And above all, I guess, how are we going to ensure that the AI transformation, such as it is, will be inclusive rather than regressive? So I look forward to a very, very exciting session. And with that, over to you, Daron. We're very honored to have you with us, and thank you for making the time.
Thank you very much, Shekhar, and I'm really looking forward to this conversation as well. I'm going to make a few points which pertain to the question that you outlined. I do believe, and I think the evidence supports this conclusion, that AI will be transformative. It will be transformative just for the simple reason that it will be used a lot and it will be applied throughout the economy. But transformative neither means good nor productivity boosting. It could be transformative while having lots of negative effects, and it could be transformative while its productivity gains disappoint. The most important point from my vantage is that we have critical choices. And unless we recognize those choices, their nature and their implications, we will not get the benefits that AI promises, nor would we make sure that some of its damaging impacts could be contained. There are many dimensions of choice, but they are all in some critical way intersecting. Let me list what they are, and then I will go into a little bit of depth in a few of them. First and foremost, the big choice is about whether we view and develop AI as a substitute and replacer of human skills and talents, or as a complement to it. This is where I'm going to spend quite a bit of my time. The second choice that's very related is AGI, artificial general intelligence, versus AI as a tool. That is very closely related to the first one. A third choice is about AI as a centralizer of data versus one in which people own, control their data, their communications, and use AI as a way of sharing that data in the way that they wish. A fourth one is between developing countries and the world in general, and the United States, and perhaps China. So the AI leaders versus AI followers. Here, the choices very strongly intersect those of substitutes versus complements, as well as AGI, but the implications are truly important for the developing world, because AI creates the risk of opening new inequalities and new rifts between different worlds, and also destabilizing the geopolitical system around the world in general. So let me go now to my first theme, which is substitutes versus complements. Here, I think we can get a good perspective by recognizing that from the very beginning, the field of computer science, which itself was always interwoven with artificial intelligence or dreams of very powerful machines, had two very different ideological beginnings. One associated with people like Alan Turing, then followed on by Marvin Minsky, John McCarthy, etc., always viewed computers as mimicking and ultimately surpassing humans. It's no accident that Turing was very much taken by the issue of human minds being indistinguishable from computers. And the mathematical foundations of that is that because he thought of the human brain as just a computation machine, which is what he had studied at first as his most important mathematical contribution, and then that sort of merged into that. Many of the other luminaries of artificial intelligence as it became a field were his followers. The alternative from the very beginning, led by people like Norbert Wiener, an important mathematician and engineer at MIT, Douglas Engelbart, an innovator who to whom we owe many of the things that we depend on today, like computer mouse, menu-driven computers, hyperlinks, hypertext, and people like J.C.R. Licklider, who designed the first protocols for the internet, were all in the camp of computers as tools to help humans. So the complementary path. But both for business model reasons, that it's much easier to make money, especially for big tech companies, from sort of automation or selling tools of automation, and ideological reasons that the one in which superintelligence machines become our overlords is much more attractive as an ideological center of gravity. I think a lot of the young talent has been attracted to the first vision. And that first vision really fuels a ceaseless automation agenda. But AI is a very versatile technology. It can be used for automation, and we're using that, we're seeing that, but it can be used for many different things as well. And in fact, it is much more conducive to human complementarity than previous rounds of digital technologies. J.C.R. Licklider, whom I mentioned, wrote in a paper in 1960 entitled Man-Machine Symbiosis that in not too distant future, human brains and computers will be coupled like nobody can imagine, surpassing both human brains without computers and computers without human brains. What he had in mind was computers providing much better information to human decision makers so that they could excel at the tasks that they were performing or other problem-solving activities. Of course, that was an aspiration, not a reality, and that aspiration was completely impossible in the 1960s, 70s, 80s, 90s, 2000, even 2010s. Advances in AI now make that a possibility. So that's the sense in which AI provides much more pro-worker capabilities than previous digital technologies. But right now, that possibility is not being exploited because this is not the direction in which most of the investment goes in. It's a tragedy, in my opinion, because both the societal broader implications of AI would be much more positive. Automation creates inequality, automation creates dislocation, automation creates imbalance between capital and labor, and ultimately will start creating unemployment. Nothing wrong with automation, but it needs to be counterbalanced or complemented with other technological steps, which are much more in this complementarity direction. So it is a societal problem if we just double down on automation. But it's not just because of its distributional implications or societal implications, for example, for democracy or societal peace. But actually, I think the evidence also supports that productivity gains would be higher if you can make workers more productive rather than just in a few tasks you replace them and get some 20 or 30% cost savings. Automation is not as easy as it first looks. It appears like the path of least resistance for many business leaders and technologists, but integrating automation is a challenging task, and very few companies have really made big money or big growth from just automation. The most successful companies in history have always been the ones that have come up with new goods and services, and that really requires human complementarity. Now, when we come to the second decision, AGI versus more tool-like AI, you can see it's the same choices, but in a somewhat different guise. In particular, the current big advances are taking place in generative AI and large language models. But the architecture of the large language models is very much motivated by artificial general intelligence. Large language models really try to mimic human intelligence. That's their metric, that's how they were trained, that's the inspiration. Whereas other approaches to AI, including developing domain-specific models that are not trained to just sound like humans, create much more complementarity possibilities. In fact, I believe that the choice of pro-worker AI will likely, not for certain, but likely necessitate different architectural choices as well as just applications that are different, but based on the same foundation or large language models. So in some sense, the large language model craze, though quite inspiring because of the advances that took place even faster than optimists could have hoped for 10 years ago, I think there's a bias there towards the automation agenda and a bias against creating these counterbalancing new technologies that are more pro-worker, that create more new tasks and possibilities for workers. Who owns data is another very important direction of change and choice. Communication problems, ranging from current social media's mess to surveillance in countries such as China, spreading outwards from China to every part of the world, including India, United States, Western Europe, and so on, are all about, choices about who controls data. So the current AI approach, both in the United States and China, is based on information centralization. You don't own your data, And as much of your data is going to be in the hands of one or few organizations. Those would be the Communist Party in China. It could be the state in India. It would be the big tech companies in the United States. Information centralization presumes that you don't own your data, you cannot control your data, and that shows itself in various different forms. In China, for example, a huge amount of data collection has given a boost both to the AI industry, but also to surveillance. In the United States, I think the apex of this is the algorithmic feed, where your data is being harvested and social media companies decide exactly in what order you should see videos. So the element of choice is taken away. You see here the parallel between people being disempowered in the production sphere by machines doing their tasks and people being disempowered in the communication and the data sphere. But there's another analogy here. The models that are going to be truly human complementary, like the ones that I was hinting at, really require high quality data. So if, for example, as an instance of pro-worker AI, I always give the example of blue-collar workers or electricians. It's not just journalists and academics who can benefit from AI. Electricians can benefit, for example, having a tool in their hands that gives them reliable information on how to deal with complex problems that they couldn't deal before. But that requires high-quality data from other better electricians dealing with these edge cases. But how are you going to produce that data? How are you going to get that data into the hands of the developers who are going to develop these domain-specific models? I think the best way of doing that is actually compensate those who produce the data. And that's not possible on the current trajectory because information centralization pushes against data ownership. So there are both architectural and legal issues here to consider, and they are, again, choices. Finally, I want to talk about the international dimension. The current AI hype or boom is pushing us in two pernicious directions that are related. The first one is that everything centers around the United States, perhaps one or two other developed economies, and China. It is those countries' needs, those countries' language, those countries' data that are most important, unless there are some routine tasks that are offshored to India for data labeling, etc. That and the automation focus create the danger that there will be a huge increase in inequality between countries. First of all, AI aims to replace a lot of tasks that were offshored to countries such as India, because now they can be performed by AI. But more generally, if AI goes in an automation direction rather than human complementary direction, many of the developing countries in the world will be harmed by it because human resources, middle skill workers, are still their comparative advantage. So if you think of the development path that many countries, for example, in East Asia, followed, it was first in low skill and then medium skill tasks. They start exporting and they start improving their productivity. And India started doing the same as well in the 1990s to some extent, although in a different set of industries than the East Asian tigers did. So all of these pathways would be closed with true advances in AI if they were to become a reality. But there's another international direction that's also very dangerous, not as a pure inequality producer, but as a destabilizer. The belief that we are heading towards AGI and whoever is going to get there first is going to have a huge strategic military advantage is also making global cooperation impossible, especially between US and China, and it's making it less likely that there will be global cooperation, say, between the United States and India. Whereas AI is a global technology, and many of the problems that you can deal with using AI, from climate change to developing new services and goods for a changing demographic or pandemic preparedness, and all of these things are actually global problems, require global cooperation, global regulation. And the negative effects of the AI race on global cooperation would also be costly for us. It's not too late. All of these choices are things that we have to make now and in the next decade. Another misleading rhetoric from the AI industry is that everything's going to be different next year. AI is advancing very rapidly, but there are true bottlenecks. Spread of AI is going to be slow. Developing applications that are truly productive is going to be slow. Integrating automation or integrating human complementary technologies into organizations is going to be slow. We don't have time to waste, but I think there is still time ahead for a better global framework, better regulation, but most importantly, a clear-eyed agreement within society, starting with the democratic process and civil society, about what it is that we want from AI, what it is that is feasible from AI. And I think if we have that conversation, it will crystallize that what we want from AI is not ceaseless automation. It is more of a tool for humans, and one that can both support productivity and be pro-worker in the sense of creating jobs and creating opportunities. And that's not where we're going. That's not going to happen by itself. And optimism that's excessive in the tech industry in the United States, that because these technologies are impressive, somehow they're going to benefit everybody, I think is misplaced. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Daron. Maybe I can turn to Dr. Nageswaran for his discussion.
So thank you, Shekhar, and it's a privilege to be able to share the virtual stage with Nobel laureate Mr. Daron Acemoglu. So a pleasure to be on the same panel, and don't think he has left much for me to add, because he has covered a very vast ground. And I think I'll start off from what you began, Shekhar, by saying that, you cited Schumpeter's comment about productivity is everywhere except in statistics. I think it's partly because I think in the financialized world that we live in, and we haven't been able to address that, even after the 2008 financial crisis. I think a lot of hype and financial markets oriented behavior creates that hype, and therefore it always precedes by a vast distance the real changes. So that is why we feel that the real effects, positive or negative, are slow to come, because I think, and we have been seeing several newspaper stories in the last month or so about how circular the investments between these companies are, about between 5 or 6 of them. And the amount of losses that these companies are incurring, which I believe, for example, came out in the Microsoft's quarterly statement as to the losses incurred by OpenAI, because they have to disclose their investment and their losses in OpenAI, and that shows some $11 billion last quarter, etc. So you have to justify these losses, and you have to therefore continuously create the hype that something major is either happening or going to happen, etc. And naturally, in this environment, the real life consequences, good or bad, are going to follow with a huge lag. But I think I'll come to Professor Acemoglu's points about the human-centric AI, and he pointed a fairly bleak picture, and unfortunately, I think it's a realistic picture, that what is coming out is more of an automation-centric AI development, which is going to replace labor, and the implications he drew for inter-country or international inequality, because many of the jobs that are being offshore can be done by AI, which probably suits, in a macro sense, developed countries' aging problem, but it doesn't address the intra-country inequality in developed countries themselves, because the fruits of such, let's say, reshoring due to AI may not necessarily accrue to the workers, but to the owners of capital, the productivity improvement. And I think in that sense, the way things are going, especially when you put the financial investor returns as a top priority, that is unlikely to be the case. So he's right in saying right now the way it is heading in terms of automation and data centralization And so question is, productivity improvements may happen, but who gains from the productivity improvements? How the spoils are divided will be an issue for developed countries and will be an issue in developing countries as well. So developing countries will face, therefore, two headwinds. One is the existing models of growth may be undermined. And on top of that, some portions of the capital-intensive developed countries economy, like for example, in India, the large companies which are capital intensive, etc., they will become even more capital intensive and even less prone to hiring. And some of the other sectors also, which will then automate. So I think the job creation prospects will definitely have an impact. And therefore, intra-country inequality will also become a big challenge. Now, I can speak about what the government of India has been doing. Of course, first of all, we don't have yet the computing or GPU capabilities that China or the United States has. We have a fraction of it at the moment. That also, in a way, puts us at a disadvantage in terms of developing Indian data-centric, whether it is LLM or other models that can sort of compete with the LLM models, which are developed and trained on different data sets, which are rooted in different cultural pathways and historical pathways. That's the. And then he spoke about data ownership. Just this morning, I get an email from OpenAI that a monthly subscription of 399 Indian rupees that I paid, which is about $4.4 maybe, is now good for 1 year. What I paid for a monthly subscription is now good for 1 year. Well, on the face of it, obviously, the subscribers are going to jump up, but look at it. It's going to make it more and more difficult for a later entrant to compete with this. And there is no, and with 700 million potential users, the data that they are going to capture, matching the prompts and the persons, and more intricate data depending on the kind of files, data that people upload. It's one thing to have a prompt. It's another thing to upload a file or a data and then ask the AI app to do the analysis. Then the amount of information that you are providing is much more than what you would provide if you're simply asking a prompt, making a prompt. I think these have huge implications, because from there, where the data goes out to whom and for what purposes is completely outside the control of those who generated the data and the country. So it has got both personal and sovereign implications. Now, as for the job creation, the job displacement, and I think my favorite paper in this, apart from the book that I read, what Dr. Acemoglu wrote with Simon Johnson about a year or two ago on this AI dimension, I also refer to this paper by Andrew Haldane in 2018 of ideas and institutions that deals with the aftermath of the previous industrial revolutions, which, even though they were much slower in terms of the pace, but the amount of time that the labor markets took to adjust and to absorb, and some of them never found the kind of same jobs or same incomes that they had before. So there is a huge gap between the advent of the industrial revolution and everybody living happily ever after. There is a huge gap in between. And that is going to be a bigger issue. And we are beginning to see that in India. So while we can talk somewhat bleakly about education, skilling for AI jobs, creating new fields like prompt engineering, etc., there is a concern about the job losses, and because we have to create 8 million jobs at least a year in India, and the median age is about 27, and this demographic sweet spot is supposed to be for the next 10 years, maybe stretch it to 15, and AI has come in at that time. And on top of that, you have manufacturing, which is obviously a huge strategic space occupied by China at the moment. So you do really have a formidable problem from the technological resource perspective and the financial resources that are required to match the technological abilities that US and China have, and then the demographic challenge. And then how do we motivate students to take up jobs that will be least disrupted by AI? For example, Professor Acemoglu spoke about human complementary AI, and he mentioned this example of an electrician where the AI can actually help him or her with proper information that could actually make them do the job better. Now, in that sense, we need to find occasions where, like maybe a counseling, maybe elder care, or welding, plumbing, electrical, carpentry. Some cases even robotics may replace them later, but that at least comes 2-3 years down the road. Let's wait for that. But these are not fashionable. Everybody in India, even in rural India, would either like to go and work in steel and glass buildings with wearing a suit and a shirt, rather than wearing a helmet and with the tools and implements in their hands. So that is another issue that we need to find, how to make non-AI impacted jobs fashionable and respectable among people. There are a couple of good areas where AI can help India, which is in taking education to the remote corners, and also reimagining and disrupting this rote-oriented education itself in schools and in primary and secondary schools. That can happen. The second area is healthcare. Again, reaching the remotest corners, because India has huge numbers, and the number of doctors and nurses that we have are not adequate in terms of reaching the last mile, and there AI can help. But I think I'll conclude my remarks with one last point, and I think Dr. Acemoglu correctly pointed out there are important political and policy choices to be made. And the problem is that, just as we learned during COVID, that public policy made by epidemiologists eventually turned out to be hugely counterproductive. Public policy choices to be made by technologists with respect to where we direct the AI is also likely to be economically and socially counterproductive. It is a choice of the elected political executive and the administrative bureaucracy that has to do it and recognize the trade-offs, just as we did with nuclear technology, etc. In some cases, we have to define the boundaries of where this AI deployment begins and stops. But then, of course, there will be hue and cry about competitiveness, etc. So it is a very wicked problem of all public policy challenges that we are facing. At the moment, there are a lot more questions and answers that we can provide. So that is where I stop and hand it back to you, Shekhar. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Daron. Thank you, Anantha. I think somebody said there are more questions than answers. And I also feel this is such a broad intellectual landscape that we're only going to scratch the surface in the limited time available. There are some questions on chat. There's already a question, which I think, Anantha, you've already answered, on healthcare services. So let me actually turn to Payal Malik, who heads the ICRIER team on digital issues. I know that she's got a lot of questions that she wanted to ask.
Yeah, thank you. Though, first of all, I should thank Professor Acemoglu and Dr. Nageswaran for accepting our invite. And it's so wonderful, a short chat, but a very, very meaningful chat on this topic. So I just, a continuation and a segue to how Dr. Nageswaran ended his comments. Of course, technology is not neutral. AI is no different. A technology which is premised on data extractivism, and we know it now from the platformization of internet, does transfer a lot of surplus and rents to the creators, to the technologists, to the companies who are able to extract this data. In a situation like this, at least from the experience, so I'm a bit sanguine on what could be the policy levers and how to therefore how do governments reclaim their agency. They lost their agency in the Web 2.0 era, or the platformization of internet. How do they reclaim that? Courts, governments, by and large, have not been successful to do that till date. Again, in the previous round of technology produced by the same set of handful of companies, other than Europe, which has been able to do something at the margin, but that Europe is also withdrawing given the kind of threats it is facing on dealing with a heavy hand on these American companies. that's one. So how do governments and societies make those choices and reclaim the agencies? And secondly, on AGI, given such a fractured geoeconomics, how do you see, sir, that a consensus can be reached, and what's the way out?
Well, those are excellent questions, and I'm really encouraged by Anantha's comments, which were very much on target and very accurate. So actually, I think the answer to both of those questions lies in the same observation that civil society and the democratic process are not as powerless as they appear. Part of the reason why tech companies can act with such impunity isn't that they have armies or that governments are in their pocket. Now, for the first time with the Trump administration, there is a lot of alignment, but even the Trump administration cannot act with complete immunity. So the democratic process, civil society pushback can have big effects. We've seen that, for example, when there was uproar about social media or when there are regulations passed with the European Union. So both on AGI and on international issues and on social media and data ownership, I think an awakening in civil society among the public could have a very big impact. And for many of the things that Anantha and I were emphasizing, Anantha more so than me, but I also emphasized at the end, I think you need the international civil society. And that's a harder problem, but it's not an impossible one. Right now, no developing country, even one as powerful and as populous as India by itself, is not enough. So then it seems quite clear that the solution should lie in forming global alliances. And there should be a bloc of countries, perhaps led by India, which have similar development, broadly speaking, similar development levels, and can articulate common principles on data, on the direction of AI, on what they want from AI, on their workforce development, and how they interface with global tech companies. BRICS is definitely not the right forum. It's controlled by China and Russia, and neither of these two have the authority nor intention to speak for developing countries. So it should be countries like India, Indonesia, Bangladesh, Turkey, Mexico, Brazil, the Philippines, and one country I think needs to play the leadership role. And given the importance of digital technologies and its role, India is a natural leader.
Thanks. Maybe I can be a bit provocative here. So both of you have talked a lot about, the need for public policy intervention. What if we were to say that is the appropriate role of the state simply to strengthen the social security net? So there are all these worries about job losses, about mass displacement. What should the state do, especially a democratically elected state? So you've got a democratically elected state. Should it not simply focus on making sure that these people who have been displaced are tided over? I would note that in early 19th century England, the welfare state hardly existed. So that was surely a factor which contributed to the horrible circumstances there. Shouldn't the public focus be squarely on that? Or do you see
I don't think so.
a directive role? Please.
No, I don't think so. That would be a minimum. And if there was nothing else, I would, of course, take a social safety net. If there was nothing else, I would also take a universal basic income. But I don't think ex post redistribution is enough. First of all, it's never perfect. Secondly, it does not realize the potential of AI, which I try to articulate as being much more productive and useful to humans if it went in the pro-worker direction as a useful tool. Third, I think even redistribution and a social safety net would not solve problems related to status hierarchies, some group of people being elevated much above the rest. And that could be internationally, again, some countries taking the lead, or within countries, tech entrepreneurs and engineers getting all the status and manual workers becoming losers. I think all of those problems would be much better addressed if, in addition to a social safety net, I think there's more of a proactive agenda where democratic process and the government don't try to be the entrepreneurs. That's not going to work. They don't try to be the innovators. That's not going to work. But they try to articulate what are the socially beneficial direction and facilitate the steering of AI in that direction.
So my 2 cents worth, Shekhar, is actually the AI choices and social security being an answer, both are endogenous, because to the extent that the choices that we make with respect to AI influence growth outcomes, they also influence fiscal capabilities. And therefore, how does the government get the revenues to even consider distribution or social security as an answer if growth itself is going to be weakened by, let's say, because of large-scale mass unemployment or labor displacing technologies, etc. And whatever little growth there is, it's captured by owners of capital and technology, which happen to be always together. Then this question becomes somewhat moot. That's one answer. The second answer is that it's a lazy solution to some extent. And we did, in the past, we have spoken about, when we talk about the benefits of free trade, we have said, well, there will be winners and losers, but the winners will compensate the losers. But it never happened. And we find ourselves where we are globally right now, because these are political economy questions, and there is a power imbalance that you always have to take into consideration. And then the third dimension is that it kind of makes the citizen or the individual dependent on the state, or ultimately the people who benefit from the productivity, the firms and the institutions that benefit from the productivity gains of AI, being willing to contribute those tax revenues to be able to then distribute to the losers. Then we know that capital is globally mobile, and they can easily, relocate and find tax efficient solutions to keep the benefits and not necessarily provide state with the resources to be able to distribute to those who were adversely impacted. Then, but the thing is, if I have to go and stand in front of a social security office or every week to be able to collect my check, maybe in India it comes in an online transfer or whatever. The thing is, what it does to your self-esteem and self-worth, etc., all these things also become important considerations. So I agree with Professor Daron Acemoglu that it is at best sort of a minimal solution if it were possible in the first place. But I think one good news, if I may say so, and I put the word good in quotes, there is a paper that came out, and I think it's from MIT professors are also part of that. I think especially I see Professor Joshua Tenenbaum is from MIT. Mm-hmm. And he is part of that paper. It is benchmarking world model learning, dated 22nd October 2025. So barely a couple of weeks ago. And what they say is that, the human's ability to adapt to a different situation. Let's say you are a cook in a kitchen, but you go to another place, maybe a service department in a different city, in a different country, and the size and shape of the knives and the utensils are different. The vessels are located in different places, but you adapt. So this is called a world model. Now they subjected they subjected 3 AI apps and also 517 human participants. And across the various tasks they gave, humans outperformed the models. And scaling compute improves performance only in some environment, but not others. In other words, what they're saying is this adaptability isn't yet there in these AI models. And it seems to be more a case of memorization with these LLMs rather than the real general intelligence. So this is considered to be one of the most pioneering and benchmark tests. And if it is the case, I would actually consider it as good news, because in some sense that maybe the fear that they will completely eliminate human ingenuity is still quite a few years away. If this paper is a good indicator. I'll stop here. Back to you.
Okay, thank you both so much. That was a fascinating discussion. I know that we need to wrap up now, but I would like to really thank Daron and Anantha for their contributions. I think I can see some interesting consensus emerging, which is that perhaps it's not all it's cracked up to be. It'll be very slow to disseminate. When it does, there is a role for the state to make sure that we follow the vision of Norbert Wiener rather than the vision of Alan Turing. And it's going to be a very live issue. It's going to be with us. So I hope we have many more conversations like this from all of us at ICRIER. Thank you so much for joining us this evening.
I hope so too. This was fantastic. Thanks for being part of the conversation.
Thank you for
Making me
having
part of
too,
the conversation.
Shekhar. And pleasure e-meeting Professor Daron Acemoglu. Yeah,
Thank you.
thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.